The next item of business is consideration of business motion number 9297 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to today's business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9297. Minister.
Moved.
Thank you very much. And as no member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 9297 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Thank you very much. The next item of business is consideration of business motion number 9286 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Tribunal's Scotland Bill. And I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak buttons now. I now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move the motion number 9286. Minister.
Moved.
Thank you. And as no member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 9286 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Thank you very much. And that takes us to the next item of business, which is topical questions. And I now call on question 1 from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it has taken to ensure that those who require social care services receive appropriate assistance.
Thank you very much. I'll call on Minister Michael Matheson.
Funding for social care is provided to local authorities through the Local Government Block Grant. It is for local authorities to manage their budget to ensure that people receive the social care that they are assessed as requiring. The Care Inspectorate inspects social care services to ensure that the services provided are of high quality and works with providers to drive improvements in quality across the sector.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
The Minister will be aware about the report in the Herald, which said that 20,000 people were not receiving any service at all despite needing this, and many others cannot afford to pay for those services and depend on families to fill the gap because care charges have increased so much. He will also be aware that Highland Council are looking to take £4.5 million out of their reserves to pay for adult care. Is it now time to consider fully funding the Council tax freeze?
Minister.
Well, Rhoda Grant made reference to the article which was in the Herald, which highlights the number of individuals who would be expected to receive social care is lower than what had been predicted off the back of the report that they made reference to. And of course, we'll give consideration to this particular report. But over that period of time, expenditure on social care services in Scotland has been increasing. So since around 2007, the budget for social care provision was just over £2 billion, and it's now something in the region of £2.8 billion. So there has been a continued increase in the level of expenditure on social care provision in Scotland overall. Now, the issue of care charges that Rhoda Grant also made reference to is a matter for each individual local authority. They have the discretion to decide upon which areas that they wish to charge for, with the exception of free personal care for the elderly, which is funded directly by the Scottish Government. So it is a matter for each individual local authority to consider these types of issues and to come to a decision on these matters. And the other point that she raised was the issue that had been raised by NHS Highland with Highland Council in regard to a resource transfer for the provision of care that NHS Highland are having to pay for. And I noticed that even within the article herself, she said that drawing on money from, I think I paraphrase her, money which is meant to be for a rainy day, today it's pouring, so the money should be used. I think it's important we recognise that through the greater integration of services, we can make sure that we align our health and social care services much more effectively in order to deliver the type of social care and health care that is necessary. And on our final point, as you will be aware, the Scottish Government in each year where we have introduced the council tax freeze has funded that to local government.
Rhoda Grant.
I thank the Minister for the response, but the reason it's pouring is because we're shifting the balance of care from acute services into the community, and the cost of that is falling on local government while they are having their budgets squeezed. He'll also be aware of Unison's report a couple of weeks ago, Scotland, It's Time to Care, where that squeeze seems to be falling on the workers that are providing that care. They're low paid, overworked, working zero-hour contracts with insufficient time to care. Will he review home care to make sure that it's properly resourced, that the people delivering it are paid a living wage? And will he legislate to make sure that all public sector, all those paid from the public sector, either directly or through contracts, are paid the living wage?
Thank you. Minister.
Okay, I'll try and address a number of those different points. Rhoda Grant made reference to the fact about, again, the £4.5 million that NHS Highland Health Board are looking for from the Council. Again, this is part of their integration approach to how they manage their resources in order to meet local need and to do so in an appropriate way. She will recall that she did stand in a manifesto at the last election, which was to continue with a council tax freeze. I don't know whether the Labour Party have now changed that position and are now in favour of increasing council tax, but it is worth reflecting that council tax under the last Labour-Lib Dem government went up by some 60%. And I think during the present economic difficulties, one thing that people in Scotland can be certain of under this government is that we have frozen their council tax in order to give them that additional capacity within their own home budgets. She also made reference to workforce issues within the social care setting, and there are a range of challenges within the social care setting in order to meet the workforce demands within the different professional groupings. The Care Inspectorate have been doing work in this area, as have Topical-Qs, the Scottish Social Services Council, in order to look at what can be done in order to help to make sure that the workforce has the necessary skills and we have the right type of investment going into helping to support that workforce. And a key part of that is to make sure that people are adequately financially rewarded for their work. That's why, as a government, we have led the way in the public agencies that we have control over in taking forward the living wage. As we've done as a government, we've encouraged our partners in local government to do so with their workforce as well. And as a government, we would like to encourage those within the independent and in the third sector who deliver social care provision to also look at the provision of the living wage for their workforce. It's important that we all work together in achieving that, and some of the work that's been taken forward by our different agencies in order to support the social care workforce is targeted at making sure that we continue to push up standards within this setting.
Many thanks. We have a couple of more questions on this subject, so if we can keep them brief, we'll get the next question dealt with too. Nanette Milne, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be aware of my concern about the provision of care at home, particularly in the recruitment of home carers. And in my region in Aberdeen, this is a particularly serious problem, given the competing interests of the oil industry. Without proper care at home and a proper number of carers, I fear for the success of the integration of health and social care, in the person-centred nature of person-centred intention of that legislation. Can the Minister give me any comfort for the way ahead in this difficult problem?
Minister.
Well, we do recognise that there are challenges within the social care workforce in order for services to be able to recruit the appropriate staff. And I know that in the Aberdeen area, in my discussions with the Chair and Chief Executive of NHS Grampian, that there are challenges across a number of different professional settings to recruit staff where they're in competition with the oil industry. I think some of the work which we are undertaking through the Care Inspectorate and also Topical-Qs is to look at what we can do in order to help to make sure that we support the workforce much more effectively and to make it as attractive as possible for individuals to move into the social care workforce. But an important part of that I do recognise, as a government we recognise, is the rate of pay that's involved in some of this work. And that's where I think the living wage has an important part to play, and why we would encourage those within the sector to look at how they can utilise the living wage as a way of incentivising individuals into the social care setting, but also to help to retain and support the staff that are presently within the social care workforce.
Thanks. Bob Doris.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be aware that the Delegated Legislation Committee will scrutinise regulations this week to ensure that carers and young carers who can now receive support in their own right from councils will not be charged or mean tested. I very much welcome these regulations, but can the Cabinet Secretary update Parliament on what steps towards carers receiving support in their own right, how the timetable is progressing for that?
Minister.
As long as the member doesn't mind, it won't be the Cabinet Secretary, it will be the Minister who will have to respond to his question here today. But what I can say to him, he's right, that through the Social Care Self-Directed Support Act 2013, which comes into force as of April, we've laid down the regulations which prevent local authorities from being able to charge carers for services which are being directly provided to that carer in order to support them in their caring role, and that will make sure that across the country that carers have a consistency of approach and that that's properly recognised by the type of support that are being provided by local authorities. Can I say that I think there is still much more we need to do to help to support the carers within Scotland, and there's a range of policy areas that I wish to see further improvements being made in. For example, we have already out to consultation on the possibility of a carers bill being brought before Parliament to look at how we can improve access to a carers assessment, how we can make sure what is a major issue for many carers get access to information about what services are available near local area, and how we can put these on a statutory footing much more effectively so that we can provide more support to carers in what is an invaluable role that they play within our society.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now move to question 2. Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government, in the light of the recent breakdown of mackerel quota talks, what steps it is taking to support fishermen.
Cabinet Secretary Richard Lockhead.
It's very disappointing that the four-party coastal states agreement on mackerel could not be reached when Edinburgh hosted the talks last week. Science is telling us that the stock is in good condition at the moment, and this seemed like the best chance for several years to secure a deal and resolve the international dispute. However, while the failure of the talks is regrettable, we do not anticipate any immediate impact on the Scottish mackerel fleet. The EU has set provisional quota, which has allowed the fleet to continue fishing while the talks continue, and the first seasonal component of the Scottish mackerel fishing season has now finished. Our priority now is to continue pushing hard in cooperation with our industry for a sustainable international mackerel agreement with Norway, and possibly also with the Faroese when talks resume in London tomorrow. If signed, any such agreement would set the final quota for this year and would also contain provisions to give our fleet access to Norwegian waters, if necessary, when the next mackerel fishery opens in September.
Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. With Iceland now out of the picture, given that they have set their own unilateral quota, does the Cabinet Secretary believe the EU should now focus its efforts to try to come to a tripartite agreement between the EU, Norway and the Faroe Islands, and not simply rush into a bilateral agreement with Norway?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do agree with Jamie McGregor. I think that is the most sensible way forward. Clearly, our preference is to have a four-party coastal states agreement with Iceland on board, that being the interests of the sustainable management of what is a major fish stock. But in the meantime, as I indicated in my initial answer, in terms of the talks in London restarting this week, we are hoping that the Faroe Isles, will be part of those talks, and at least we can explore the idea of a three-party agreement in the short term.
Jamie McGregor.
Has the Cabinet Secretary raised with Commissioner Damanaki the rather alarming concerns that Iceland is seeking to catch even more mackerel on top of its unilateral quota by using a loophole allowing its vessels to use Greenland's quota for mackerel? And in terms of the impact this dispute is now having on the demersal whitefish sector, does the Cabinet Secretary share the concern of fishermen that when half of the North Sea, the Norwegian sector, is already closed to EU fishermen due to the ongoing dispute, Marine Scotland has just introduced 7 real-time closures in the North Sea? Why was the impact of obviously disproportionate cumulative displacement not factored in before these batches of RTCs were announced?
Cabinet Secretary.
There was a number of questions in Jamie McGregor's supplementary there. Firstly, in terms of Greenland, yes, I am concerned by the fact that Greenland now may be part of the problem moving forward in terms of resolving the mackerel dispute. The Scottish Government is in contact with the European Commission today to express our concerns over the developments at last week's negotiations involving Greenland. I will obviously use the first opportunity I have to raise this personally with Commissioner Damanaki in due course. Also, in terms of the whitefish fleet, clearly This week's negotiations over mackerel will have a bearing in terms of the timing for making last week's agreement over whitefish stocks, which has been agreed in principle, come into actual force, and hopefully all parties would sign that once the mackerel issue this week has been taken forward. So they are interrelated, both the whitefish stocks and the mackerel stock, in terms of international negotiations. The final point with real-time closures is clearly one of the reasons why our stocks are improving in Scottish waters, and have been for some time now, is because of the massive sacrifice by our fleet in terms of pushing conservation measures. Now, real-time closures are part of an overall toolbox of conservation measures. We do require them to ensure that stocks that we don't want to catch are avoided, especially juvenile stocks, as well as continue our good efforts towards the overall sustainability of fish stocks in Scottish waters.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
I share members' disappointment at the lack of progress in mackerel negotiations, and I wish the Cabinet Secretary well in negotiations which are starting tomorrow. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he's had any discussions with the Marine Conservation Society, who currently class British, European and Norwegian mackerel as yellow, while Icelandic and Faroese mackerel is listed as red, over whether the lack of a resolution to this situation poses any threats to the current certification of Scottish mackerel?
Cabinet.
I can assure Claire Baker, I've been in touch several times in the past with the Marine Conservation Society over the classification of the mackerel stock caught by Scottish vessels, because I don't think we should be tarred with the same brush as other fisheries, given that our fishermen are helping the stock to recover and are fishing within agreed management regimes. If there's been any change to the Marine Conservation Society's classification in the last few days, I'd be happy to learn about that and intervene again if that is the case. But I'll certainly keep a close eye on their classification of the Scottish mackerel stock.
Angus MacDonald.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it's vitally important that the total allowable catch for mackerel is agreed as soon as possible, so that the bilateral arrangement between the EU and Norway, which has already been signed in principle, agreed in principle, can be signed? Clearly, we'll then at last be able to return to negotiating an EU-Faroe bilateral, which has denied our whitefish fleet access to Faroese waters for nearly 4 years.
Cabinet Secretary.
Angus MacDonald refers to the very complex picture where several sets of international negotiations are linked to each other. First of all, we have the international mackerel dispute, which was the subject of the first few days of talks in Edinburgh last week. And then secondly, we have the EU-Norway talks over the other stocks, the haddock stocks, the cod stocks, etc., which were the subject of the negotiations in the final few days of last week when we hosted these talks in Edinburgh. We have a draft agreement for the EU-Norway talks, which of course are essential in terms of the cod quotas, the haddock quotas, the shared stocks between the EU and Norway. We need all countries to put their signature to that. We have the draft agreement, we have it agreed in principle, but some countries, as Angus MacDonald referred to, want to await the outcome of the mackerel talks in London before they actually add their signature to the agreement on the table for the whitefish stocks and the EU-Norway stocks.
Thanks. And that concludes topical questions. We now move to the next item of business, which is Stage 3, Proceedings on the Tribunal's Scotland Bill. And in dealing with the amendments, members should have